justice. I'm delighted to welcome back Kenn Joyce to you in your business studio. Hiya, Kenn.
Hey, how are you, Alec? Thank you so much for the introduction. You're very kind.
That was easy. I've gone through this one before. But the good news for you is I'm not going to take you back to school. We've already taught you with that in the show on the 23rd. But people are probably saying, well, why have we got Kenn back? Well, I suppose just to give sort of a bit of a background, he's been working in music, in radio, in marketing, in web, never mind the NGO work you're doing, in property. My God, there's a whole range. I could have had about a half dozen different people here being interviewed just to cover each of the topics. But I suppose really what I wanted to get back to was each of those compartments and how they influenced your life and how you then transitioned to the next and what sort of real value you took from them. So let's take I think the music was the sort of one. I know you had a background in music from home and a love for it, but, you know, getting into it, what sort of lessons do you think you learned from people like Simon Cowell and those of his ilk, as they say?
Well, from Simon, how not to treat people. He's a very well-meaning and obviously subsequently very, very successful character, but unnecessarily hurtful. I always felt, you know, when you're dealing with creative people, you're dealing with very sensitive souls who are pouring out their heart and soul in music, and you need to, I always felt you needed to treat them with tenderness rather than being ruthless in your criticism, albeit that, you know, I mean, Simon's argument is, well, I'm being kinder than you are because I'm telling them the truth and you're faffing around the outsides. And so it's just different approaches. But unfortunately, in certainly a smaller country like Ireland, you have to be very careful about telling people the truth because it's often the last thing they want to hear.
Well, the truth, I suppose, if delivered in the correct way, can make a substantial difference. And I mean, what you're talking about here is what we might call corporate communications, and how somebody at the top of their particular field communicates to those around them. Now, we're not all trying to make friends, but what could be learned from that?
Oh, gosh, well, I'm probably not the right person to ask about that. The music industry is not corporate communications or nothing like it. You're dealing with, you know, highly inflammable egos and pressure situations and great creativity and a degree of ruthlessness, frankly, that I've never seen in any other business. It is so cutthroat, and people will, you know, stamp on each other if they think it will help them get a little bit higher on the ladder in a way that I never saw in the corporate world. I mean, obviously everyone wants to succeed in the corporate world, but sure. The ruthlessness with which those in the music industry applied themselves to the politics of the industry is what rendered the industry unsuitable for someone of my meek demeanor.
But well, certainly what you did is you saw the sort of what we might call nearly ill treatment, but sort of rejected that. But did you feel that with your own sort of personality, it might not be strong enough to survive it?
Yeah, I wouldn't have been strong enough to survive. You need to be really thick-skinned, and you need to just not care what anyone says about you or does to you. You just need to say, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to. I mean, I take my hat off to people who can do it. Bono and Bob Geldof are heroes of mine for the way that they, I mean, Bob Geldof is not the world's greatest singer, but he didn't let that stop him becoming a world famous singer. Yes. Bono was, you know, the first time I saw them play was in the Dandelion Market for 50 pence. And, but he, you know, he called for 17 weeks, the Late Late Show, every single night for 17 weeks or every single week until he eventually got on the show. And that's what started it all for them. And that kind of tenacity sure. in a creative spirit is unusual in my experience, because usually people who are creative, by being good at creativity, they have to be sensitive souls. And usually if you ring somebody up 10 times and they just don't call you back, you kind of feel, well, what's the point? And they're obviously not interested. But people like Bono and and those that really succeed in the industry just have the tenacity and that to keep going. And I don't think I had that. I don't think I was strong enough.
It's an interesting one in terms of sort of management as well, that having to manage these sensitive souls, you really have to have a lot of latitude in how you behave around them, I suppose.
Well, I felt you did, because I empathized with them as a musician myself. I knew what it felt like to pour out your creative soul. But in commercial terms, Simon Cowell has been an awful lot more successful at it than I have. So
sure.
Who's right? It's a kind of a tricky one, isn't it?
Well, I suppose it's a lesson for anybody who's thinking getting involved in that industry. That certainly thick-skinned is one of the sort of boxes you better be ticking on your CV.
Yeah, well, for just about anything nowadays, I mean, social media, I think, is the cruelest form of personal assassination I've ever seen. Like some of the things that kids, my own kids included, like when they communicate with each other on social media, because there's no face-to-face interaction in that, it's very abrupt and it's very to the point. So perhaps they'll grow up tough, thicker skinned anyway, because that's their environment. But it never appealed to me for its lack of gentility, let us say.
It's interesting you should sort of open up that cauldron in terms of social media of today, because you do have, your fingers in some of that pie. I mean, where is this all going? Because we talk about children communication with one another, often in acronyms and what I might nearly call pidgin English. How is that going to dovetail into the establishment that already exists?
I don't think it is. I think it's going to create an entirely new one. And, the headmaster of my son's school recently proclaimed that by the time the boys who are entering the school now this year finish,
sure,
75% of the jobs they will be going for currently do not exist.
But I'm sure the English language will still exist.
Well, I wonder if it will. I mean, as you've described it earlier, it's a form of pidgin English that's used online now, and, text messaging and everything, and Twitter requiring so many letters means that abbreviation and acronym is the way of everything, in my day, it was FYI and ASAP, and that was about it. Now everything is abbreviated, and I have to keep googling things, messages my kids say, what do these letters stand for? I say, oh, that's what that means. Okay, so but like, it's their culture, it's the way that they'll grow up, and it'll be normal for them. So as I say, it will be a very different world, and I think the fundamentals of communication will remain the same, which are, in my view, that, it's like a book. If you don't grab them immediately, it doesn't matter what else you have to say, because they're gone. So that's the most important thing to do, is to grab their attention. The second most important thing is to tell them very clearly and unequivocally who you are and what you're doing and what you're about, so they can make sure they're in the right place, or else they're gone. So, the fundamentals of communication, I mean, that all of these things were true for, billboard advertising, magazine advertising years ago, as they are in the e-world nowadays. But it's just the way the communication is delivered is now a lot more laconic and didactic.
From somebody who has such experience, of course, the media, and still involved heavily today, I mean, our listeners will probably be looking for cues of where to go to next. I mean, we hear that it all should be video, social media, the importance of it, but not necessarily so for every sort of organization.
Well, I would tend to disagree. I would suggest that is the case for every organization now. I mean, even when I was growing up, there was a reluctance to read something if you could be told it instead, because reading something is laborious and involves work. So now, with the advent of available videos to tell you things, I find, myself included, if there's anything I want to know, I'd much rather click on a YouTube video where somebody's going to tell me how to do it, rather than get a manual out and try and read through it all. And because A, it takes longer to find out if you're in the right place. B, it takes longer to go through it. And C, you're not sure you have the full recipe until you've read through the whole thing, which is, of course, a lot more time consuming. And I think people are much better engaged with more than one medium. So it's not just eye to paper communication, it's also oral as well as visual. I think, attacking two senses like that has got to get the message across easier. And plus, the old expression, a picture says 1,000 words. So, they can see the face, they can see the person they're dealing with, they get a feel for, what kind of an individual it is by the way they speak and the intonation they use. They'll get an idea as to what that person is about and whether they actually sound like they know what they're talking about, which, is very difficult to read between the lines of.
I find it quite fascinating if you sort of look at the dichotomy here. So really what we're talking about, if you want to engage your audience, video is the way to go because you can be seen and interact with it. And at the same time, the same people who want this interactivity in terms of communicating with each other will just text and will be sort of blunt trauma texting.
Yeah, well, there are two different types of communication. If you're trying to cajole someone into listening to you, you want to use video and explain things to them politely and nicely. And that if you're just literally trying to say no, yes, whatever, well, then obviously texting is going to be quicker and doesn't involve the time and all of the politenesses, if you like, involved in making phone calls where you have to say, hello, how are you? And how's your mother and all that? Anyway, I was calling about this. And would you be free for that? Yes, no. Okay, great. Well, listen, we'll catch up some other time instead. Takes an awful lot longer than are you free on Wednesday?
Yeah, so social grace is out the window.
In the name of efficiency. So not all bad, just different.
All right. I mean, as a person who's involved in YouTube, and again, in the world of marketing and your experience from it, I see so many videos of sort of the CEO of companies standing up there and saying how brilliant they are. And let's put that up as the corporate video on their website. I mean, is that the right way? Or, there must be better ways of doing this.
Depends where you come from and what kind of culture you have. I came across clients in my advertising days who would see the fact that they had an advertising budget to spend as an excuse to put their profile up, so that when they went to cocktail parties, people would say, oh, you're the guy on the ad, or I heard you on the radio, or that kind of ego tripping stuff. And typically speaking, people who are not trained as actors and trained as presenters don't come across very well. Occasionally, you'll get the odd Mattress Mick type character who's just so eccentric and he's entertaining anyway, even though he is atrocious in the way he presents everything. It's just so bad it's actually funny. But generally speaking, being so bad that it's funny is not the way the CEOs of corporations want to come across. So for 9 times out of 10, I would advocate the employment of a professional presenter for the corporate world.
I mean, do you help any of these people that you meet up? Do you polish them up in any way if they ever ask you to do some of this work?
No, I'd send them off to Bunny Carr or whoever the current equivalent is. But 9 times out of 10, if they don't have a natural ability, which very few people who are not trained do, I would discourage them from doing it.
Yeah, it's probably good advice. So let's talk about. I want to go back a bit for you, because I mean, you've had such an eclectic life. I just wanted to go back. Radio, of course, was something for you. Where's the place for radio today? Says he, hoping that it's going to continue.
Well, the thing that radio offers now and continues to offer and would always have to offer is the immediacy of the news that it can deliver. A podcast by its nature is out of date by the time you're listening to it. So I think radio will stay around for that reason. However, as you have seen, most radio now also has a webcam in the corner of the room. So effectively, they're like television programs. And radio broadcasters increasingly are learning the various skills of being television presenters as a result. The the great thing about radio is that you don't have to listen to Harbour Hotel for 20 minutes before the program you want to hear. If you
I
don't
liked
want
Harbour
to.
Hotel.
I loved it too. Listen, Chris Kern was one of my favorite guys. But you know, if you're not a fan, you don't have to wait. Now you can just flick ahead to or go to the podcast of the next program and that kind of thing. Which again, you know, you lose a certain cultural education as a result of that, because being forced to listen to stuff that you mightn't always be interested in was still educating you as to other people's tastes and things like that. Whereas now we can become very, very specialist in what it is we like. And I don't believe that's necessarily going to be good for social structures of society going forward, for the simple reason that, you know, as is well documented by experts in the whole area of the humanities, you know, any kind of specialist by their nature, as they go on in life, knows more and more about less and less.
Right.
So when these people get older, there's nobody they can talk to who understands what they're talking about anymore, because they're such specialists in their thing. And I feel that, you know, the availability of information and the ability of people to choose what it is that's of interest to them will ultimately cause society to break into all of these lines of people who don't really understand each other, and it may cause a breakup. But that's as at today. Who knows what could happen with technology in the next couple of years? You know, it's all moving so fast now, and with you know, Elon Musk putting these coin-sized things into people's heads that can make people who are paraplegic be able to move their arms and legs again, likely to come online within the next decade.
Wow.
You know, and therefore, you know, you could literally also download any amount of information you wanted and slap it into a little hard drive in your head that you would carry around with you and have at your disposal anytime you like. I mean, it fundamentally changing the whole dynamics of intelligence, which was usually judged by one's ability to remember things of historical significance to a particular situation and then communicate them as effectively as possible in the shortest amount of time.
Right.
That definition of intelligence won't work anymore.
No. And it's quite interesting, because I think we're struggling in terms of, we're all experiencing the fourth industrial revolution and sort of the convergence of science, technology and communications together. Like, one of the big challenges I was reading in a survey was that about 80% of people only take their source of information from one singular source and are liable to accept nearly anything as being true.
So George Orwell got it right, you know.
Yeah.
It's sad because and also, you know, people don't verify the quality of the information. They see it on Twitter, and because it says it there, they say, well, it must be true. You know, I mean, look at how many people around the world sincerely believe that the COVID-19 injections that we receive are actually being sent by Bill Gates, who's putting little chips in everybody so that he can track us. I mean, that's quite a well-known phenomenon around the world, and conspiracy theorists everywhere are saying, yes, that's what's going on. I mean, it's a nonsense. Why would he want to? And how could he? And who would let him? It's just, it's so nonsensical. But this is the power of social media, that people will actually start to believe this stuff.
From your own perspective, as somebody who's a sort of creative director and has worked in media, where's the future lying for people? You know, if you were to give some advice to the corporate world on how to maybe adjust to it, have you any sort of tips around that?
No, in a word.
I better come back to you another day.
It's just, it's moving so fast the whole time. You just have to constantly monitor and constantly update and constantly follow your Google stats and look at the research. And every day there's new CRM type systems coming out, analyzing your data for you, telling you which bits of your marketing are working most effectively, giving you conduits to different people. So really, you know, one of the most vital people that you will have in any organization from a communication perspective going forwards is going to be your e-communications manager, for want of a better description. And, they would be fairly linear thinking, probably from a computer background. And again, specialists. But I do foresee that the people who will be most successful going forward will be those who have developed a creative ability within themselves, because that's the only thing that's always going to be unique to humans.
Fantastic. I'm going to kind of switch tack here slightly because, as I said, you have quite an eclectic mix. Let's talk about sustainable energy. I mean, that's one of the fields that you're involved in at the moment. Maybe you'd like to tell our listeners a bit about that and maybe your thoughts going forward around it.
Well, I don't think anybody needs to hear it from me. Look at the fires in Greece recently. Look at the results from the powers that be in terms of what global warming is doing. I mean, we're killing our planet, and guess what? The time frame for that we have to reduce carbon emissions and bring the planet, make the planet cooler and all that, it's getting closer and closer. Our expectations were we had first of all a couple of 100 years, then 100 years, then 50 years, then 20 years. Now it's down to 10, if that, before it's irreversible. We've done so much damage that it can't be done. I mean, they're saying now that the damage that's been done to the oceans in terms of the increase in temperature as a result of fossil fuels and the other forms of pollution, we're looking at least 2,000 years before that can be rectified. 2,000 years. And that's if we stop today.
Yes, which is hardly likely.
It's a really serious issue around the world. And again, the conspiracy theorists for years were saying, oh, there's no such thing as climate change. There's no such thing as global warming and all that. So, it's good that it's finally being taken seriously. And at last, they're putting metrics on things as well. Whereas before, there was a general feeling that if you were a socially conscious investor, you would only invest in companies who were environmentally aware, and that. It started in the 1970s with the American companies that said, we guarantee if you invest in our fund, nobody that gets any money will have anything in any way to support the Vietnam War. And socially conscious investing has grown from there. ESG is the biggest one at the moment, the biggest buzzword, environmental, social, and governance related investing, where it's got to meet those three. But the biggest of them is the E by a long shot, because that's the one that's really going to affect us all. But, the Kyoto Protocol started things off quite well. Paris in 2015 has changed it for much bigger picture kind of view of things by saying things like, well, if you are to, for instance, invest in the development of a forest in Iceland,
right,
we will give you credits for that in Brazil, because ultimately you're still affecting the planet. And that's the perspective that needs to be taken, much like we have done with the COVID-19 virus. I mean, I think it's very exciting to live at a time when, for the first time in history, a pandemic has actually been tackled by a species, and we are that species, and it's happening today. And we're doing it as a result of communications, etc.
Sure.
On a global scale. And I think that's very exciting, and we're winning.
Good. And I'm glad to say we are, thank goodness. It'll be interesting to see what the future holds. In terms of your own involvement with sort of sustainable energy, would you like to share anything about that?
Well, my particular interest it comes from when I was studying my pilot's license, I learned about atmospheric pressure and how it works and what creates it. And I learned about gravity then. I also did an advanced scuba diving license, which taught me about neutral buoyancy, where if you're a scuba diver and you want to go along at 10 meters of depth, and you don't want to go any deeper because your oxygen will burn up. You don't want to go any higher either, because then your oxygen will expand and you'll end up shooting out of the water. So you have to become what's known as neutrally buoyant, which means that you're floating, for argument's sake, 10 meters below the surface of the ocean. And I often wondered then, with the changes in atmospheric pressure above and the fluctuation in the gravitational force of the Earth, as the oceans of the earth move up and down as they breathe each day with the fluctuation in gravity, would a neutrally buoyant item 10 meters below the surface, would it stay still as the water goes up, or would it rise with the surface of the water and then descend? And the Sorbonne in France came to the conclusion that it would go up and down with the surface. And so my initial idea was, well, that means we could have a piston head beneath the surface of the water, which wouldn't affect traffic on the surface, which wouldn't create any environmental visible pollution, and be going up and down, and we could therefore use it to drive a generator and create electricity. That's where it all began. It's gone on over 15 years now since that, and we're now at the stage where, thanks to Enterprise Ireland funding, we have secured proof of concept documentation from Trinity College, who spent a couple of years working on the physics of how to actually create apparatus which will produce significant electricity, which is sufficiently usable to plug into the grid. And our current designs are assessed by them to be capable of producing double the electricity of solar or wind power per dollar spent on infrastructure, which means we're basically half the price. And given that gravity is predictable and constant, unlike solar or wind, you don't ever have to worry about how much of it's going to be created, because you always know exactly how much gravity is going to move every day. And it's been doing the same for 500 million years, so it's not likely to change any day soon. But because of that predictability, you can use more complex financial instruments like puts and forwards and futures to buy your energy years, decades in advance, which you cannot do with solar or wind, because they're unpredictable. You don't know when the sun is going to shine. You don't know when the wind is going to, you can average it all out and say you can guesstimate, but with gravity, you can be exact. And that's why I love it.
Can I say this, Kenn? Once again, it's been a pleasure, and time has just rushed by. This is why we've had the second show. Really, what a great way to finish the show.
Well, I'll give you a slightly more positive note. We got a letter of offer last week to fund gravity electricity for the first 3 years. So we are, the lawyers are going through it as we speak, but it looks like as of now, we have the first 3 years of finance in place, which is over 5 million euros. So that's very exciting development since I spoke to you.
I'll have to get you back again to hear out more about this. You know?
Give me a few years.
What a great way to finish the show. A special thanks to my guest, Kenn Joyce, for coming into the You and Your Business studio today.